Hi, good afternoon, and thanks to be back with us for an amazing afternoon. We are going to talk about watches, starting with great talks with Watchbox, one of our main sponsors of the Reluxury events. You should come. You should come next time to Geneva because, we have so much fun and we get so much great insight thanks to the amazing speakers and panelists attending the event. This afternoon, we are not only talking about watches, but as well emphasizing the role of luxury brands to support the artisanal ship and also make sure that they can, get a great coverage and a great visibility through the brand. We will also develop and emphasize the benefits of integrating metaverse and Web3 technologies to go and move forward a more sustainability transformation and make sure that we can leverage technologies for a purpose. Sorry, I'm so much energy that I get a bit shaken. No, and we will also go through, something that will really impact the industry for the fact that the end consumer is evolving, and we will emphasize with the Ed School about the change regarding, the end consumer and emphasize the Gen Z and understand the way they will consume, they will purchase differently. We will finalize the afternoon with a wrap-up and a great movie of Watchbox and De Béthune in order for you to better understand and better discover the brand. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for being with us. I've talked too much, so it's time for us to give the floor to Watchbox and to these great watch experts who will talk a lot about, the differences between independent and long-established horology houses. Thank you very much. And gentlemen, the floor is yours. Team MOSSO. Waco for Revolution and the Rake magazine. And Jack FORSTER for Watchbox as well.
Okay, testing.
All right. It's exciting.
All right, so you guys know Wei, you probably know me, and you know Jack. Wei, of course, founder of the Rake and Revolution. I'm the watch specialist at Watchbox. Jack's a longtime pro in this business. He's now our global editorial director at Watchbox. So Wei, I'm going to throw the first question to you. The fundamentals of collecting don't seem to change much by brand, but why would you choose independence as a new collector over established brands in the first place?
Well, let me first just say it is such a pleasure to be on this stage with you, Tim, and also my longtime compadre, my brother from another mother, Jack FORSTER, who is, from my perspective, next to you, Tim, the greatest technical writer and journalist on the planet. Well, both of you. So I feel extremely intimidated by the amount of knowledge and acumen on the stage.
I've always hoped that I would get a Nobel Prize for most long-winded watch writer.
Yeah, but everything you say is nuanced and meaningful to me. Right.
Thank you.
So why would I be attracted to independent watchmaking? I would say that in order to be interested in watchmaking to begin with, the journey or the pathway would actually bring you through big brands first, right? And I would actually go so far as to say that if there wasn't a Rolex, if there wasn't a Patek, there would be no watch industry at all, right? They created the fundamental sort of like a basis for watches to flourish and for them to be interesting and for them to be relevant to an entire generation that actually doesn't need watches, right? Because what we have on our wrist are expressions of emotion. So I'm going to go a little bit back and talk about a parallel between watchmaking and art, right? So before the advent of the camera, the way in which you valued art was how well it depicted reality, right? And then after the advent of the camera, where reality became democratized, the first important artistic movement was Impressionism, where it became about emotion and expressing emotion. So similarly, before the quartz crisis, the way a watch was valued was based on precision, how well it kept time, because if it didn't keep time well, you could die. I mean, you could really literally die if you were on a train and you were a conductor and you were timing things imprecisely, or you were on board a ship and you were the guy in charge of navigation and you couldn't read the marine chronometer correctly, you would die, right? So after the quartz crisis, where electronic watches were made accessible to everyone and precision was democratized, I would say that the rise of watches again came about because of them becoming emotional objects. So then you have to ask yourself, well, what emotionally satisfies you? So you would go through, of course, the process of a sports watch like a Rolex because the mythology is incredible. You know, everything associated with that brand is incredible. And you would be, deeply affected by a Patek because if you like complication, all right, then that is the master of complication. I would actually even throw a third one in there, which would be Cartier, which is the king of elegance. But then, if you're thinking about it purely from an emotional perspective, somehow the more personal the journey is, the experience is, the more the personal it is in terms of getting to meet the creator whose name is on the dial or actually is behind the brand. To understand that inside of him is something unique that he's trying to display to the world. And because he's Swiss or French, but working in Switzerland, and as a watchmaker, he can't articulate it to you, but he can show it to you based on the beauty he's able to create with this wonderful object that is keeping time, but really is just about expressing emotion. That's when I think you start to sort of fall in love with independent watchmaking.
I think there are two different advantages here. There's the advantage of being very close to the source and having a personal relationship when you choose a smaller independent brand. And then with a larger legacy brand, oftentimes you have the certainty that comes with group ownership, with the finances that entails, the ability to get parts and service forever. And maybe I'm just assuming too much, Jack, but I also feel like with some of the bigger brands, the Cartiers of the world, the Omegas of the world, frankly, they just don't care if you sell the watch. So there isn't the politics of the independent brands. Could you talk about some of the, advantages and disadvantages of choosing an independent versus a group brand for your collection theme?
Well, I think that Wei has touched on something really, one of the big advantages of dealing with a larger company like Rolex or Cartier is obviously better access to parts, better access to after-sales service. I'm wearing a Cartier tank right now, first introduced commercially in 1919, and I look down on my wrist and I'm basically seeing exactly what you would have seen this is a tank Louis Cartier, so maybe 1920. But you're basically seeing exactly what you would have seen if you had a Cartier tank on your wrist in the 1920s. And that kind of continuity over a period of many, many decades is really, really important to a lot of folks. That sense of connection to a brand in the better sense of the word, brand in the best sense of the word. You feel connected to a decades-long history of absolutely masterful design. You're connected to a network of service centers that can keep your watch going for as long as we all actually hope watches will continue to work. And when you first start out collecting, I think that, or when you first get interested in watches, let's say, because not everybody becomes a collector, but when you first start out, you get a lot of the same sort of sense of specialness out of just having a mechanical watch at all that eventually you might need to go to an independent for. So, I'll never forget when I got my first good Swiss watch. It was an Omega Speedmaster Professional, which I'm old enough to remember watching men walk on the moon on live black and white TV. And I knew I wanted a Speedmaster when I was 6 years old, and it took me, I don't want to say how many years to actually get one, but, I felt like I'd entered a very small, very exclusive club where, it was fine that not everybody appreciated what was on my wrist. It was fine that I would have to explain it to people. There was a story that I could tell about it. Houston, we've had a problem. We've had an undervolt in main bus B. But then you realize that what you thought was an almost non-existent community. There's actually a community of people who love these things, who collect them, and then you start to look for finer and finer points of differentiation. And that sense of being part of a community of people who are not only crazy, but a very special kind of crazy, is what you get out of, being a patron of an independent brand.
I would also say that realistically, we look at, I don't want anyone to come into this with prejudice that this was just going to be beating up on big brands and touting independence. There are advantages to buying watches from large brands. Aside from the surety of parts and service, you also have some of these communities built up over decades around model families and model lines. We have the Speedmaster enthusiasts from Omega, we have the dive watch enthusiasts for Rolex, and we've got our pilot's watch enthusiasts for IWC and Breitling. Those are very real advantages, especially if you're going online and your first point of contact with the watch community is the internet. Some of these well-developed communities can actually be great assets if you are buying from group brands. Wei, just in terms of independence, I guess the counterweight to that is going to be that you get closer to the creator and you have more of a relationship with, say, the person who designs your watch rather than a retailer or an online forum.
Well, it's interesting because I know we're all talking about watches in terms of which kind of communities they connect us to. But I don't think that there's basic, I don't think everyone is either one way or another, right? Like, I feel as if, like, for myself, like, I love the Patek community, for example. Like, and when I look at the gentleman that's in the second row, and I admire the stunning 5990 in rose gold that he's wearing on his wrist with the travel time competition and the chronograph, this guy is really cool. Like, I want to know more about him, and I love his choice on this watch. I also admire the fact that he managed to buy it. And there's so many interesting sociological implications related to that. Like, I would want to have a drink with him or a coffee with him and have a chat about how he got that watch. But at the same time, if I saw someone wearing like something super nerdy, like an RRCC2, for example, or a Kari, or something even ultra nerdy, or like a Sylvain Pinot or a Raoul Pages, or something, then I would be very intrigued to know what brought them to that watch as well. And because I am a person that is, shall I say, culturally polyamorous, like, I'm very interested in the communities of people who love big brands, but also in the communities of people who love small and unique brands as well. And for example, Richard Mille has a very specific community, right? And sometimes today it's associated with a hype community, I think it's what it's called, right? But I love that community. I find them to be super interesting and always, like, yes, larger than life and certainly very affluent because that's what the watch commands. But I feel there was always a warmth there because I think it's been imparted by the guy who created the brand, right?
No, without a doubt. I think it's important to remember that the most successful independent brands are built around a charismatic personality, whereas the most successful group brands generally are built around a successful business plan. When you have a Max Busser, when you have a Richard Mille, when you have a Kari Voutilainen or a Francois Paul Journe, Richard Mille is a businessman, and Max is mostly a marketer. And of course, Kari is a watchmaker. So these are very different kinds of people coming from different backgrounds, but having that strong central guiding light is really important both to the viability of the brand and to the creation of a community around it. Jack, if you could talk a little bit about maybe the roots of the independent watch movement, which started for the most part in the 90s, and how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, it's funny. There was a period, of course, at the beginning of watchmaking, basically there was no such thing as a group brand, right? Every watch was made by hand. They were made to order. They were mechanical toys for merchant princes and actual princes. And so, we had a situation where industrialized watchmaking had yet to be born, and for a couple of hundred years there was no such thing as a group brand. Every watch was an independent watch, right? And even to the scale that Breguet produced, off the top of my head, he's the closest thing I can think of in the history of traditional watchmaking to somebody who kind of approached being a brand, and the fact that he was knocked off enthusiastically, copied enthusiastically during his lifetime is kind of a testimony to the success of the Breguet name as a brand. So then we get to the period of industrial watchmaking, which came about as a result of the invention of something really boring, but these milling machines, which nowadays are controlled by computers. I don't care whose factory you go into. On the ground floor, where the foundations are strong enough to hold them up, are 5-axis computer-controlled milling machines. So that is the basis of the watch industry. They're the unsung heroes of our industry. So those machines actually had a lot to do with independent watchmaking becoming possible, because you could realize ideas in ways that you couldn't realize them before. And in the 1990s, we started to see the emergence of, a Viennese halter, for instance, with the Halter Barnes Antiqua. That was one of the first really kind of crazy out there independent watches that I remember seeing when I was, first started looking at watches. And then by the time we got to the year 2000, there were already lots of folks, well, not lots of folks, but there were already plenty of folks making, who were independent watchmakers who were finding a market that didn't exist before. And to go back to Wei's point, this is really thanks to the quartz crisis. The watch became not divorced from precision, because like keeping time accurately, I think, is the fundamental social compact between any watch and any watchmaker and any client. But without that being the primary reason for being interested in a mechanical watch, suddenly you had a tremendous amount of artistic freedom. And it became a group brand after a while, but I remember seeing the Ulysse Nardin Freak for the first time in 2000 in New York, and I mean, that watch went off like a nuclear bomb in the growing online watch communities. I mean, nobody had ever seen anything like it before, and we also, a lot of folks started saying to themselves, like, let's see what we can do. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it's about the same period of time we saw F. Bjorn get his start. I mean, he was a very experienced watchmaker, as we all know by then. But the fertile ground necessary for the growth of an independent brand, the presence of an audience that were communicating with each other over the nascent internet and could actually, they could say to each other, hey, look, this is something really, really cool that is not necessarily in the public eye. This is, we're creating a tribe of taste that is closer and more exclusive, and we feel more interesting and more characterful than simply buying a watch as a commodity from a bigger brand. And I mean, Tim made a great point, which is that we're not here to trash the big independent brands, because you need an industrial base for watchmaking, right? I mean, the independents have to get critical components from someplace, unless they're incredibly stubborn, cost is no object, and they're willing to make absolutely everything down to their own jewels. But without the big industrial brands, the industrial base necessary for both big brand, group, and independent watchmaking wouldn't exist. So, we owe to the Rolexes and the Omegas of the world, for instance, we owe to them the existence of the watch industry, the continuity of the watch industry, the swatch, with the plastic swatch. We owe a lot to that for, I think that there's a line of continuity between collecting plastic swatches and realizing watches are collectible, and starting to collect at a higher and higher and higher level until finally you get to people like Francois Paul Jour, and you get to brands like de Bethune. So that transition happened in a relatively short period of time. And it's funny to think that, in a way, I mean, everybody talks about the quartz crisis as having brought about the death of independent watchmaking, or not independent watchmaking, but the near death of mechanical horology. But the truth is, without the quartz crisis, we wouldn't have the fascinating independent brands we have today.
So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to ask some of the folks on stage to talk to me in more concrete terms. First, we're going to do some definitions. Obviously, Rolex is owned by a foundation. Audemars Piguet is family-owned. Patek Philippe has been owned by the Stearns since 1932. These are all technically independent, but they're not really what we mean when we talk about the indies. Could you talk about what we mean from a collector's standpoint about small independent brand? What is a small independent brand? And give us some examples that qualify.
Sure. I actually have a slightly contrarian perspective on what independence means as well. And I would actually say that, yeah, Rolex, even though it's the biggest brand on the planet, is, to a large extent, completely independent. Incidentally, could I just pause to mention, those knuckleheads that were spray painting the orange paint on the Rolex boutique in Knightsbridge, like the Stop Oil guys, I mean, do they not realize that actually the Rolex is a foundation, and they donated a tremendous amount of money to the environment, first of all? And second of all, did they think about how much water it would take to clean out the paint from an ecological perspective? And third of all, did they think that the paint they're using is in fact oil-based, right? So just to continue from there, so I feel as if what defines independence to me is not necessarily the size of the business. It's about the founding spirit of wanting to do something completely unique and individual, right? So, for example, one of the biggest brands on the planet is the brand that's helmed by Alex Mills, who's in the audience there at the end, his father, right? What up, Alex? Right, but at the same time, the spirit in which that brand was created was so profoundly independent, so profoundly iconoclastic that nothing had ever existed like that. I remember going back to those early days in the Basel Fair where Richard Mille will walk around and he'd show, this is the most shock-resistant tourbillon on the planet, and if you didn't believe him, just throw it on the floor. Like there's no, and that is incredibly rock and roll. That is so independent in spirit, right? So yes, of course. So there. So of course there is, to me, guys like, so if you look at the kind of like holy trinity of like smaller independent watchmakers, all of which were at the same company at one point in THR, right? So if you're looking at Francois Paul Jour, Vianney Halter, and Denis Flageolet, they all basically want to do something completely unique and their own. They want to create a voice, a type of music, a language that is purely their own and doesn't reference anyone else. And I think that's incredibly important. Or it doesn't reference anyone else in contemporary watchmaking. Of course, Francois Paul references, everyone from Breguet to Anti-Janvier as Vianney as well. So for me, it doesn't really have anything to do with the size of your business. It's just kind of like do you have just a fervent dedication to just doing your own thing, regardless of what anyone else is doing that? And through doing that, do you create your own success?
Yeah, I would say there's absolutely no lack of focus at Patek, Audemars, or Rolex, so they do have a very independent streak in terms of how things are planned. But I think collecting independent versus group brands ultimately comes down to your personal priorities. Here's an example from my own history. I once had a pretty impressive collection of Jaeger-LeCoultre watches, and I thought that what I was doing was putting together a sort of a digest of the greatest chapters in the history of one of the greatest manufacturers. But what I realized once I was quite far down this road was that what I really wanted was to be able to know the people who created them, to meet the person who planned my watch, to have a relationship with the factory and be part of a very small and tight-knit community of people who love something very special and very rare. And as many merits as JLC has, there hasn't been a Jaeger or LeCoultre running the company since 1948. So I ultimately chose, you know what, I'm going to sell my collection and rebuild with independence, and that's an ongoing journey. Jack, how do you decide what to collect when you have the option of bigger group products or independence? What are your priorities that guide that decision?
Well, I consider myself very fortunate in that as a journalist, I can't afford to collect anything, which makes the decision-making process extraordinarily easy. The world is my oyster. Everything is open for consideration. I can appreciate everything on its own merits. One of my favorite writers once said...
Should I have asked Wei that question?
Yeah, probably. So to answer the question a little bit more seriously, there are several things that I particularly love about watches and watchmaking. The first is I'm obsessed with the pursuit of mechanical precision. So I really, really tend to focus on, and I really tend to enjoy watches and watchmaking that are about, look, a good Swiss lever escapement, modern mainspring alloys. I mean, these are very difficult things to beat. The remontoir d'égalité has not been necessary for that last bleeding moment in precision since probably, I don't know, I'd say the 1950s at least. However, trying to push the boundaries of what you can do technically to get that extra half second, per day out of a watch movement is something really fascinating to me. So I'm interested in brands that pursue technical watchmaking as an end in itself. So Francois Paul Journe is one example. De Bethune is another. The stuff that De Bethune has done experimenting with the fundamental components of the regulating organs of the watch is absolutely fascinating to me. I'll never forget the first time I saw a Grubel Forsey double tourbillon 30 degrees, which is an absolute, on a certain level, it is the biggest solution in search of a problem I've ever seen in my life. But it is an absolutely obsessive Rube Goldberg approach that really actually makes logical sense in terms of what you can do to adapt something that was developed for the pocket watch, the tourbillon, into the wristwatch. The second thing that I'm really interested in is I'm a big booster for traditional French-Swiss hand finishing. And traditional hand finishing is really, I'm speaking to an audience of people who are, the only reason you guys are here is because you already know a lot about watches and you're really interested in them. And real hand finishing is really rare. Like real hand finishing, throughout is extraordinarily rare. It's very, very time consuming. It requires a lot of specialist training. It requires a lot of specialist tools, and it does not scale. So if you're making 60,000, 70,000, 100,000 watches a year, there are probably not enough people in all of Switzerland who actually know how to do traditional hand finishing to traditionally hand finish all your watches all the way through, which is not to say you're going to get an unattractive watch, but you're not going to get a hand finished watch. And you have in independent watchmaking, there are several independent watchmakers who are making watches at such a small scale and such small numbers that they can actually afford to truly hand finish their movements, and not necessarily all of their movements, but the ones that exist at the highest end and are the most important to collectors. And you go to these places, you see these manual processes, you see things being done the way they were done 100 years ago, when the French-Swiss modern idiom of movement decorating as we know it was evolving. And it's really astonishing. And that sense of connection that you feel, with a particular human being, sure, but also with a set of human hands is really one of the things that makes, to me, collecting from the independents super, super, super compelling.
And Wei, what are your priorities when you put together a collection? I know you tend to vote with your heart. but there's still a process upstairs. You were one of the early proponents of 90s and early 2000s Roger Dubuis as a modern collectible class. So, to the extent it impacts whether you choose a group brand product or an independent brand product, what priorities drive your collecting?
Well, Tim, as a man who's 53 years old next week, on the 11th, if I'm not asking for presents or anything, just
send him a card.
Right, a card is fine. Now that I'm in the sort of the winter of my age, the second half of my life, my priorities have obviously changed, and I think that the thing that is most meaningful to me is to have a relationship with the person that is either who founded that brand or who's helming that brand, right? And also to have admiration for that person as well, So since we have Max Buser in the audience, one of the reasons why I love Max Buser is first of all his story and the fact that we had a conversation and we look at Max and we imagine him to be wildly successful based on his extraordinary communicative ability and his amazing good looks, right? But actually, he's had to struggle, and he's had some moments where he told me he was literally on the verge of going bankrupt several times. In particular, the very first moment when the company that he had contracted to build his watches basically handed him a shoebox full of parts and said, "You're on your own," right? And that just only makes me love him more because he had to overcome that, and it only makes the bond that I feel with him stronger, right? And at the same time, when we did a charity event called the Pink Dial Project last year, he gave us a PS Unique Mad 1, which then sold for $175,000, and that was such a kind thing to do for charity as well. So all of these things to me make a huge difference now. For Denny Flageolet from De Bethune, for example, the fact that I've known him for so long and that I've always just adored this guy, and to see him finally having his moment where people are globally recognizing him for the genius that he is, it makes me really happy as well. Someone like Felix Baumgartner, who is, he's a genius, but he's also, he can be curmudgeon-y at times, and he really just says it like it is, which will be super entertaining because he's on the jury of the Grand Prix tomorrow. But I love his spirit, his kind of badassitude, the fact that he just doesn't care, he doesn't give a shit, And all of these very human dimensions are what makes collecting important to me now as well. So that when I look at that watch, I'm reminded not only of something that with extraordinary beauty that's living and breathing on my wrist, but of that relationship I have with those people. And I think that's very true for collectors in general. I think that for them, the wonderful thing about having an independent watch on their wrists is the opportunity to meet that person, to understand their mind, to develop a relationship and a friendship. And I think that it's the most beautiful community in the world because of that for me.
It's definitely important to remember that a lot of these brands, the smaller brands, do a very good job of curating their own community and their history. Richard Mille, I have to admit, the watches never quite grabbed me, and I never really understood what made them so special to the people who collect them. And then I spoke to the collectors, and they said, well, you should meet the people I've met, and the places I've been, and the things I've done at the invitation of the brand, and the lifestyle that came with the purchase. And I sat and I thought, well, yeah, I guess the ideal, if you're providing any kind of a service, is to turn a purchase into an experience rather than just a one-and-done purchase. And then also, I saw the phenomenon surrounding the Mad 1 watch from MB&F, which was basically a friends and family type piece, a love letter to collectors. And it's fundamentally a very simple, low-cost watch, but the magic is in the exclusivity. It's a secret handshake between you and other people who are like-minded. And then there's the Journe Society, which is interesting because there is a certain auteur to Francois Paul, and yet he's bought into the Journe Society, and there's been a Journe Society chronometer that was designed by them for them, and the brand was totally hip with that. So curating your own community is very important if you are a small independent, whereas I think if you're a larger brand, an Omega, a Breitling, curating your history is perhaps more important, and making it less important to have a personal relationship is really kind of the key to success in marketing there. Jack, we could talk a little bit about marketing brands. There have been a lot of success stories, both big and small. Talk about the differences in how big brands and small brands market themselves.
Oh, boy, that's a huge question. Let me see if I can put together some kind of organized answer. So marketing, in the time that I've been writing about watches, I've seen the way that watches are marketed change dramatically. I've seen the communications channels change dramatically. I started out on Usenet news groups talking about watches back when there basically was no internet. And then with a good sense of timing, I started out on the first internet forums on timezone.com and on thepurists.com. And those were enthusiast communities. The watch brands didn't want to touch us. I mean, the internet was a place where, all sorts of unsavory things went on, and a true luxury brand didn't want to have anything to do with the internet. And then with a wonderful sense of timing, just as the watch internet was really taking off, I went back into print with Waco, worked at Revolution, and then at Hodinkee and now at Watchbox. And the biggest difference that I can see in the way that the independents market themselves versus the way that the larger brands market themselves is that the practices for marketing for a larger brand necessarily change very slowly. Typically, there's a tremendous amount of investment in particular kinds of practices and particular ways of doing things. The transition from, or not even the transition from print to the internet, but even the inclusion of the internet happened with the bigger brands, especially with the bigger group brands, with really glacial slowness. It took a long time for them to embrace the internet as a place to communicate. On the other hand, you look at the independents, and I really wonder whether or not independent horology would have taken off with the speed that it did if it hadn't been possible for online communities to grow up around particular kinds of collectors, particular kinds of collectings, and particular brands. And just as the internet revolutionized every other aspect of human society, for better or worse, it did some really, really wonderful things in terms of providing a forum for support for independent brands when many of them were struggling for exposure. These were companies that did not have, forget about not having big marketing budgets. They didn't have marketing budgets at all. Everything was about direct contact with consumers. And in the early 2000s, you and I, I'm sure, remember seeing one exhausted founder of an independent brand after another because they had to fly around the world every 5 minutes in order to show their watches to collectors. Their marketing budget was basically airline tickets and frequent flyer miles. And when the internet came along and when the watch internet really started to expand and it became possible to post really compelling, beautiful pictures online, I'm dating myself because I actually remember this period in collecting, but that was transformational for collecting the independent brands because you could grow communities quickly, you could show things to communities very quickly, you could create bonds between people relatively quickly, and I think that kind of organic marketing that isn't even really marketing, it's just the organic growth of true enthusiasm. I think that was critical to the success of independent horology, and I think that difference is still with us today.
Now, it's fascinating to me to see that some of the best buys you can find on the market for complications, if you want minute repeaters, perpetual calendar, tourbillon, if you want split-second chronographs with compound complications like a perpetual calendar added, a lot of the best buys are actually Blancpain, Breguet, Jaeger, LeCoultre, Vacheron, Constantin. You can go online, find these things. IWC minute repeaters, under $40,000 all day long. There's always that impetus to move more product with these big brands, and that's how these bargains result. What I see from a lot of the independents is more of a concern for controlling the amount of inventory in circulation, buying back their inventory at times to control the market, and protecting the brand because they don't have a 200-year history and they can't afford to make any mistakes. Wade, talk a little bit about how some of these brands kind of protect their reputation in the market by controlling inventory and their name.
I don't think it really matters whether you're a large brand or you're a small brand. The whole thing is that if the secondary values of your watches are significantly below the primary values of your watches, then you have essentially a problem, right? Because because their information is so easy to understand now that if anyone buying the watch walks out the door and they're going to lose a tremendous amount of money, it's going to affect their confidence. Sure, there was definitely a period before this where people were willing to take that gamble, and I think that was a wonderful period, right? Like some of the greatest collectors did it purely out of passion, but I think that we're not going to put the genie back in the bottle after that. There's so much information available to everyone. Secondary is always going to be a factor. So the best brands, of course, are aware of this and are protecting their secondary prices, or also giving a better secondary experience to the consumer, right? Being able to buy a watch like a certified pre-owned Richard Mille, but it comes with a warranty and you know it's going to work and it's legit. It's not one of the, it's not a watch that potentially might have been stolen or something like that. That's incredibly important, right? I think, if I could just add something to what Jack was talking about related to marketing. I think what I love about the watch industry is the following. It doesn't matter if you're a big brand or a small brand. I don't think anyone in recent memory has been able to market something successfully in watches that was genuinely bad, right? Like your watch has to be, if not awesome, very good in order to succeed. And I think that that's a wonderful sort of thing also because through social media, whatever, their consensus is reached so quickly. Information is so easy for people to get access to. And so, for example, it doesn't matter how much someone can be passionate about that, that funny Genius watch, right? The one that looks like a toilet seat. I mean, it doesn't matter, like, the one that, Giorgio Mondani is posting, right? Like, it doesn't matter how often you try to say it's good. It's not good, right? And everyone knows it's not good. And so there's no one, it doesn't matter if you were to take, the biggest marketing budget in the world and try to festoon pictures of that on top of Place Vendôme, it's still not going to convince anyone because people are too smart. They're too aware. They're too considered today. So yes, you need to have something great to begin with, right? And then of course, if you can empower that to greater heights through marketing as well, right? Through the best marketing, which means just to make a greater number of people aware of it, right? And probably that you're capable of making. And I think what's very important now is that for the first time, the watch industry has seen the first moment of vulnerability, right? So 6 months ago, there was this moment of euphoria. 5990s were going for, over $500,000. Like, I mean, everyone was just losing their minds, and everyone was trying to jump in there and speculate, right? And then subsequent to that, we have the crypto crash, we have the looming recessions, we've got a war going on, we've got political chaos in the UK. And we saw, for the first time, watch prices come down. And I think for the majority of us, actually, we were like comforted by that because this kind of crazy speculative euphoria couldn't go on forever, right? So then the question now becomes, okay, but what happens to watches now that we see vulnerability, right? Well, the thing is, we are still probably outperforming the majority of asset classes, and I still believe in watches more now than ever. But now you have to market correctly. And when I say market correctly, it doesn't mean, that's not a bad word. It just means communicating the singularity and authenticity of what you do in the strongest way possible to gain the widest audience so that no matter what happens in the future, there is still a disproportionate number of watches that there is a much greater number of people that want to buy your watches than the number you're able to make.
Yeah, one thing that occurred to me while you were talking, Wei, was that as far marketing is definitely not a dirty word. Marketing is communication, right? And what you always want to be able to do is just tell people the truth, and because they're going to find out anyway, especially nowadays. And if your product is good, then your job is very, very easy. But one of the challenges that I think we run into with marketing nowadays is when you have sort of a disconnect between the perceived value of the watch and how the watch is actually performing in the market. And when there starts to be a disconnect between actual horological content and what's going on in the watch market, that's when I think that things start to look a little bit scary. And one of my big hopes for this correction that we're going through right now is that it will sort of lead consumers, and lead all of us back to considering whether a watch is a good watch and not just whether or not it's a good business decision.
Absolutely.
I think it's kind of interesting to look at some of the big group brands that have done things right. We often slate them for being remote or indifferent to volume versus resale value, and I think that's a little bit unfair. Sometimes they do get it right. Two great examples would be Tudor from, oh, come on, Jack. They do get it right from time to time.
No, I'm agreeing with you.
Tudor since 2012. I mean, they understood that what they are is a fan service vintage tribute brand that takes the best from their own heritage and of Rolex and remarkets it at an affordable price with a reasonable warranty at a high level of quality. Cartier spent an absolute fortune on fine watchmaking between 2008 and about 2015, 2016 when they realized, you know what? People don't come to us for mystery tourbillon perpetual calendar minute repeaters. And they did what Wei said, focus on traditional elegance. So you can absolutely get it right as a big brand. But that's maybe easier to do when you've got a legacy. Wei, you've written about new up-and-coming watchmakers. You mentioned just Raoul Page a moment ago, Sylvain Pinot, Tao Frey, Remy Couls. They're competing with now established independents to build their reputations. So is it now easier or harder to break in as an independent? There's better awareness of the space, but a lot more competition at the same time.
Well, I don't want to say it's easier, but there's a lot of advantages today that the old guys in this audience, myself, Max, that we didn't have, right? Which was, like today, a single image on social media can make you a hit, right, around the world. I mean, a great example of that was the moment that Andrea Furlan posted just the François Bourgel Tasti Tondi pusher of the Furlan Mare chronograph. People just lost their minds, right? And they became the first guys to create a brand during COVID on a Zoom call that became a commercial success that also went on to win a GPHG award in the same year, which was absolutely nuts. And to think about doing this before the era where communication was proliferate is absolutely impossible, right? The second thing too is that there is now a sustained interest and passion for independent watchmaking, which I think the world has never seen something like this before. We had a lot of growth from 2000 to 2008 until the financial crisis happened, but I've never seen this. This is unprecedented. And so this now becomes an arena of watchmaking that others enter into, standing on the shoulders of people like Max or Alex's dad or whoever, who've established this as one of the most exciting categories of watchmaking in the world. And yes, the Remy Cools of Theo Offray or Peter Memedat or Raoul Pages or Sylvain Pinot, they benefit tremendously from that. But at the same time, as we discussed earlier, you still have to be good, right? Yeah.
Okay, speaking of facts, I would like to open up the floor. Questions for Wei and Jack. These guys have been around the world many times. They have seen it all. So you've got the world at your fingertips.
Yes, sir.
One question is about Asian independent brands, and how you see. I mean, a watch like Ming, for example, doesn't have perhaps the same heritage as a watchmaker that many other independents have. How do you see the independent market for independents emerge in Asia? What do you think are going to be the trends?
As the Asian in the audience, or I will respond to that on the panel. I'm sorry. No, I'm joking.
Hey, wait.
Oh,
half,
I'm sorry.
Half
Filipino.
One half.
Exactly. Yeah, you're right.
The lower half.
Tim, are you?
No, I'm half Irish, half Italian.
Okay.
But I'm Irish without the drunkenness and Italian without the hairiness.
And out it goes to the world, ladies and gentlemen.
So related to someone like Ming, I think he's a very clever entrepreneur, right? And he created, I wouldn't necessarily say he took advantage of anything that was innately Asian. He just created a really cool design of a watch, which was then manufactured for him by Short Etienne, right? And we see other people doing this as well. One of the guys I'm super impressed with is called Atelier Wen. And that actually is a watch brand that's trying to showcase the artisanal craft available in mainland China. So, for example, all the dials are guilloché en main, but by a Chinese guilloché master, right? The movements are made in collaboration with the biggest movement factory in China, but trying to push the quality to the next level as well. There is an incredible engraving on the case in the back as well, and that's also trying to push the case makers in China to achieve something extraordinary. So I think that that brand is very interesting to me. Also, it's interesting because it's two French guys, right, who lived in China and actually met in China during their studies, and who maybe potentially was even as outsiders, or maybe more capable of appreciating the beauty of what was being achieved in mainland China to create what is essentially a brand that showcases real Chinese craft, right? So,
I'm completely non-objective about Ming because we've been friends for close to 20 years. And he was posting on thepurists.com when I think he was like 14 years old or maybe 15 years old. And I mean, none of us had ever seen anything like it before. He posted a design for a watch that had a hydraulic drive mechanism. And I criticized him for it. I was like, come on, man, like this, there's no way this is going to work. At that scale, there's so much drag and so much turbulence and so much viscosity in fluids. You can't use that to drive a watch. And I'll never forget his response was, there are people who dream, and there are people who try to stop people who dream from dreaming. And I thought to myself at the time, well, screw you, you chip on your shoulder, kid. What the hell do you know? And then he went away and became an incredibly successful photographer, and that's how the internet got to know him. First through his obsessively detailed photography blog. And I don't know if anybody here has ever sort of followed his writings as a photographer, but he brings the same level of obsessive attention to detail to his watches that he brought to his work as a photographer. It's a really particular kind of watchmaking. I don't think he thinks of himself himself as an Asian watchmaker. I mean, yeah, it's based in Kuala Lumpur. Manufacturing takes place in Switzerland. The straps are made in Paris by Jean Rousseau. So it's a global entity, And I mean, sure he's Asian. I mean, sure the company's based in Kuala Lumpur, but it's really an international brand. And there's no history of fine watchmaking in KL for him to have to, bow down to, right? He's kind of free to do whatever he wants. And within the constraints, imposed by, the laws of economics on the one hand and the laws of physics on the other, he's really kind of, living his own vision of what watches should be and what watchmaking should be.
We still got a full 5 minutes.
We got a whole 5 minutes, man.
Four
You're in here with
minutes.
me.
4 minutes.
4:54, actually.
Any questions? Yeah. Would be yours afterwards.
Yeah, I would say like established brands, they nourish on icons and they wash them like every year. Maybe we have another dial, maybe another surface treatment, habillage. How do you think like this big established brand can create new icons or go new ways, which the newcomers are doing, like the freshness?
If I could just take this one for 2 seconds, I remembered something that I wanted to say before. One of the interesting things about the evolution of the watch industry over the last 20 years is that it has become. I mean, Wei and I both remember, starting to go to international trade shows in the early 2000s, and there was an obsession with new. Like every year there was the big trade show, and you had to be at the big trade show, and you had to have something that was new and amazing and unique and never seen before and technically innovative, and here's a material no one's ever used this way before. And I think that the watch industry at one point spent 2 years just going through every single exotic material in the aerospace and F1 industry possible and putting them on the cases and on dials and all that jazz. But like the natural product development cycle for fine watchmaking is not necessarily a 1 year cycle. It takes 3 to 5 years, do you think? One of the things that independents are free to do is develop watch designs, mechanisms as well, complications as well. They're free to do things in an organic way. And, it can get I love Rolex. We all love Rolex. I mean, they make absolutely, qualitatively impeccable watches. But I sometimes feel like they're just trolling us. They won't even call the left-hand drive GMT master a left-hand GMT master. It's just up on the website as another GMT master. And they're like, what? Move along, folks. Nothing to see. Nothing to see. This is again one of the things I like about the independents is that I think they can adhere to a product development cycle for watches that's a little bit more natural and inherent to fine watchmaking than the bigger brands do sometimes.
Yeah, I think if something's good, it just stays good, right? One of the watches that I from a big brand, which is still independent actually, is the Royal Oak Perpetual Calendar, right? And that watch was introduced in the 80s, but the movement of that was introduced in a different reference a decade before that. So it's been around for a very long time. And I think there's not a person in this room that hasn't looked at the new blue ceramic version of that and said, that's an amazing looking watch, I mean, it just makes your heart stop. And then it's very interesting, the Richard Milles, the early Richard Milles, because it was so contemporary, the question was, okay, in 10 years time or 20 years time, how will they look? And they look like really cool classic watches now, right? Like the RM1, 2, 3, 4, all the way through 12, I would say, is now a defining golden age of those watches, and actually feels it's in some ways even more relevant today than they were the day they were created. So I think good stuff just endures, right?
That's part of the reason why the GPHG created the Iconic Prize, because you do have this category of mainstream watches that are iterated year after year in fundamentally attractive ways without fundamentally changing the underlying model. Do we have any other questions? We've got room for probably one more from the field. Yes, sir.
When will we see more women watchmakers?
Already. I was at Dibatoon the other day. Tons of female watchmakers. I was at Louis Vuitton Watchmaking the other day. Tons of women watchmakers. But you're talking about a star watchmaker, someone who has marquee billing. Wei, why don't you take that one?
It's a level playing field, right? It doesn't matter if you're Asian, it doesn't matter what your religion is, it doesn't matter what height you are. It's just if you're good, you're good. And I think that's what's wonderful about watches. Watches are the most sort of like it's the greatest meritocracy in the world. And I love the fact that watches transcend language, religion, everything. When I meet people, I don't even have to speak the same language with them, the actual language with them, and I can have an entire conversation with them about watches. So as to when the first female rock star watchmaker emerges, that's up to her. Right?
Yeah, I would say, remember, Moritz Grossmann was refounded by a woman, Christine Hutter, who is a watchmaker, and Eva Leuba has practiced for many years as a watchmaker with an impressive pedigree, and someday there will be like an Assoline book this thick about the works of Carol Forestier-Casapi at Cartier and elsewhere. So they do exist, and just like new watchmakers, oftentimes they rise with a low profile, but they do work for others along the way, and that's where you look to find out who the stars of tomorrow are going to be.
And I'm struggling to imagine a world where someone says, that person's watchmaking is really amazing. I would love to buy one of their watches, but they're just too damn short.
I think it'd probably be a benefit. You're closer to the bench.
Seriously.
So thank you very much for, this great talk. Please. Hold on, let me take some souvenir. Here we go. Thanks a lot for coming. It's so important to have, your insight, and because you are a true renowned expert, getting your opinion and sharing this great discussion is amazing. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Jack.